Well, someone asked me to do a presentation on the King of the North and the King of the South. And I have to say, I've been intending to do such, sort of a, documentary with images and music and all of that. And I have to say, it's a little bit of an intimidating project for the simple reason that the prophecy of the King of the North and South is so extensive. It is the most detailed prophecy in the Bible. It begins in, of course, the first part of the 11th chapter and extends all the way through to the 12th chapter of Daniel. And it begins with the breakup of Alexander's empire, as we know, into 4 segments. 2 segments, primarily, Syria and Egypt, became the first king of the north and the king of the south. And they were king of the north and south, respectively, because they were north. Syria was north of Israel, the land of decoration, and Egypt to the south. Excuse me. But in time, the Roman Empire engulfed both of those empires or kingdoms. And so it was, at the time of Christ, there was only the king of the north. And the king of the north was, of course, the Roman Empire. And the king of the north was instrumental in putting Jesus to death and persecuting the holy ones. And interestingly enough, that's how the prophecy ends. Only instead of them putting Christ to death, Christ returns the favor, you might say, as Michael, the great prince, stands up. Well, it's a fascinating prophecy. And I can't promise I'll do a documentary thing, but we can consider this sort of a primer. And because I can't speak off the cuff as regards to the whole prophecy. I don't have a photographic mind like Fred Franz did. But it's interesting, Fred Franz probably wrote most of the Watchtower's books and magazines on prophecy. And the first commentary on the book of Daniel and the prophecy of the King of the North and South in particular was in 1958 with Your Will Be Done. And at the time, the Watchtower identified the King of the North with the USSR. Previously, it had identified the King of the North with Germany at the time of World War I, and then Nazi Germany at the time of World War II. And then, of course, East Germany was engulfed by the Soviet Union. And it made sense that the mantle had passed to the USSR because maybe a lot of you weren't alive then, but I remember at Sputnik, the arms race was just heating up, and the Russians, the Soviets, were the first to put an unmanned object orbiting the Earth, a Sputnik satellite. And so the Your Will Be Done commentary seemed quite plausible. But then something unexpected happened. It was unexpected from the Watchtower's point of view and even from the viewpoint of many world leaders, statesmen, politicians, what have you. But in 1993, the Soviet Union was disbanded. And, well, it was sort of a slow process. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and there was an allowance for East and West Germany to reunite. And Gorbachev tried to make reforms with glasnost and perestroika, but then it all just crumbled. And that's when the Western bankers came in and used the Russian oligarchs to siphon off so much of Russia's natural wealth. And then toward the end of the 90s came along Vladimir Putin, and a nationalist, and he began clawing back what the Western bankers had taken. And he's been on the hit list ever since. But the point is, you have to allow me to ramble here a bit because, I read some time ago that if you have to have notes or speak from an outline or whatever, maybe you don't know your topic. So we'll see if I know my topic, and I do request for a little latitude, though, if I run off in a tangent here or there, as I just have. So anyway, the Watchtower's last commentary was the pay attention to Daniel's prophecy, and that was written about the time Vladimir Putin came to power in 98, exactly, 20 years ago. And by that time, the Soviet Union had been defunct for 5 years, and the Watchtower said, who is the king of the North now? We don't know. Will he arise as a Russia again, or a new arms race? Or, we don't know. It's wise not to speculate. Well, that's fine. A lot of people speculate all kinds of crazy things. But there's a problem with that, because the Watchtower has long taught that the time of the end began in 1914. Actually, if you really want to get into Watchtower history, originally they taught the time of the end began in 1799 when Napoleon took the Pope off the throne or whatever. So, but they've revised a few things. But here's the problem. If the time of the end began in 1914, and by the way, that expression time of the end is exclusive to the book of Daniel. There are variations of it, like final part of the days, last days, conclusion of the system, but that expression in the time of the end, or the time of the end, I think it appears about 6 times in Daniel. And in one of those places, it says, in the time of the end, this book, this prophecy will be unsealed, and the righteous will shine as brightly as the sun in the kingdom. And so if 1914 was the beginning of the time of the end, then all of these things would be knowable. But according to the Watchtower, we don't know who this king of the North is. He's changed identities many times, and now we're at a loss. We'll just have to wait and see. Well, I agree. We will wait and see. As many of you know, my view is that the time of the end has not begun. And I feel that according to Daniel and Revelation, the time of the end is that period of time. It's worded variously, expressed as times, and half a time, 42 months in Revelation, 1,260 days, and so forth. That is the time of the end. And that's when all of these things will be revealed. So it is a bit of a contradiction for me, because I would have to admit that the book is not unsealed to me either. If the time of the end has not begun, well, then who am I to say that this is right or this is wrong? Okay, I'll accept that. But I think we can appreciate that there are a number of incongruities with what the Watchtower has put out there already. So my aim is to clear away some of this refuse, you might say, and begin thinking anew. And we will have to wait and see. That is a fact. But it might be an easier wait if we disinvest ourselves from some of these erroneous ideas. I remember back in 93 when the Soviet Union collapsed. For me, it was a mind blower because, I was already pretty tuned into these prophecies. And at first I thought, well, maybe the King of the North has come all the way to his end. We're right there. Michael's going to stand up. And of course, time passed, and it dawned on me that, well, maybe the USSR was not the King of the North at all. Maybe there is a different King of the North. And that is my conviction. I've written a book on it. If some of you want to cut to the chase, the book, Jehovah Himself Has Become King, is now in its third edition, but the chapter on the King of the North has essentially stayed the same. And I really don't have anything new to add, except that some of the more recent developments with the presidency of Donald Trump and the reaction that's coming against him, I think it has only validated my view. And of course, my view is that the British Empire is the King of the North and has been since the 1700s when the British Empire came into existence. And the King of the South is America. Now, according to the Watchtower, as I mentioned, we've gone through who the King of the North is according to the Watchtower. They have identified the King of the South as the Anglo-American dual world power. Well, that is true. There is an Anglo-American alliance, but it is an uneasy alliance. And Daniel expresses it in the second chapter. Remember that colossus made up of different metals, and you get down to the feet of iron and clay. The legs of iron represent the Roman Empire, and now the iron mixes in with clay in the feet. That's a new political entity that's mixed with part of the old. And the Watchtower used to say that the iron and clay feet just simply represented a politically diverse political world, whatever. But more recently, they have identified it as the Anglo-American world power. But they haven't been real clear as to what distinguishes the iron and the clay. Some might view the iron and clay as two diverse systems like capitalism and communism. But that's really not an adequate distinction. For one thing, look at China. It's a communist nation, and it's also capitalist, and it's a sovereign nation. But really, the iron represents the empire, and the British Empire inherited that mantle from the Roman Empire. And it's a long weaving path, and I won't really go into that here. But the British Empire, and we have to make a distinction, the British Empire is not Great Britain. Great Britain is home to the empire. London is the seat of the empire. But think of the empire as an octopus with tentacles that stretch out and reach in to various institutions and nations to try to control them. And it does control them very effectively. Of course, historians will say, well, the British Empire, it was dissolved back after World War II. Well, yes, that was the colonial empire, the former colonial empire, where nations were directly under the authority of the queen or the king, whatever the case may be. But the empire has transformed itself, and primarily it is a financial, monetary empire. And some people call it, the bankers' empire. That you hear this expression now, the deep state. But there is a headquarters for this, and it is the monarchy of London and the city of London. And they control the banking system. If you control the value and the price of money, then you control everything. Isn't that true? Now, how many times have the bankers been caught rigging LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate, right? To jigger the system this way or that. How many times have London banks like HSBC been caught laundering money for the massive drug enterprise that they operate, which, again, infects all nations? The opioid crisis in America is killing 100 people a day or something like that. It's staggering. Well, the City of London invented the dope trade back during Queen Victoria's era. And they haven't given up. In fact, HSBC, the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, was set up as an offshore way to bring the booty out of China after they forced them to take their opium and take the gold back to the City of London. A lot of the wealth in London came from that original gold dope trade, and about $1 trillion a year is laundered through the banks. And London has set up all of these offshore places like the Cayman Islands. There are more banks and hedge funds on the Cayman Islands than there are people, I think. But that's the empire. That's the British Empire. The British Empire actually owns the central banks of the world. They're privately owned banks. The Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is not owned by the United States government. Federal is just a word that's plastered up there to window dressing. If you want to read a book, read Creature from Jekyll Island. And he goes into great detail how in 1913 this bank was secretly set up, passed through the Senate and Congress on New Year's Eve. Everybody was vacationing, and come the new year, the United States was beholden to a central bank. And boom, World War I came along, and the United States had to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, a privately owned bank. It's old European money. So it's a carryover from the feudal system, which was a carryover from the dissolution of the Roman Empire, overseen by the Holy Roman Empire popes. I've gone off on a tangent. Okay. But this iron in the clay, let me go off on another tangent. We think of nations, as having always existed. You can read in the Bible about nations like Egypt and Moab and, Babylon. But the modern nation-state system didn't really come about until the 1600s. I think 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. If you look at an old map from the Middle Ages, there was no such place as Germany. It's not even recognizable. It's like 100 little tribes and fiefdoms. And that was to the advantage of the empire, to keep everything split up, keep peoples divided in their little territories ruled over by feudal lords. But after 100 years' war, they realized that they needed a better system. And they hammered out an agreement where nations were sovereign and not ruled over by popes or their feudal bosses. And that was the beginning, I would say, of the first threat to an empire. But it wasn't until Columbus discovered a new land, and then, of course, the Pilgrims landed. And when the United States declared its independence, that is when the King of the South stood up again. From the time that the Roman Empire had crushed Egypt, way back before the time of Christ. And it's interesting because in the closing segment of that prophecy, it refers to Egypt not escaping, being subjugated by the King of the North. And even the Watchtower recognizes that Egypt is a symbol for the King of the South, since Egypt was the original King of the South. Of course, the Watchtower doesn't understand, has not explained how it is that the Soviet Union ruled over the hidden treasures of Egypt. They say it was because of the arms race, and it caused the United States to spend lavishly. Well, there was a lot of spinoff that came from that. For example, the NASA program develop personal computers or the technology for such, because before that it was just mainframes. And NASA engineers had to shrink that to put it on a space capsule. And so there was a crash program to do that. And then from that spin-off came personal computers and all the things from that allow us to communicate this way. So anyway, there's no possible way the USSR ruled over the Treasury of the United States during the Cold War. The exact opposite is true. In fact, some say Reagan planned it, because when he really amped up the arms race, he did so with the intention of bankrupting the USSR. Now, I'm not saying I buy into that, but some credit him with that. And that's exactly what happened. So anyway, it's interesting that this King of the South is represented as Egypt. So now with the 13 colonies breaking away from the empire and establishing a sovereign nation, and there's a vast sea separating it from London. And it's true, London did try to reacquire their breakaway colonies. There was the War of 1812, if you recall. And it's funny, President Trump last week, he bantering with Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, and he said, "Didn't you guys burn the White House down back in 1812? Of course, Canada was still a colony of the empire back then, and it was a military staging ground. So his comment was mostly true, but it was really, of course, the British Empire. I don't think it was called the White House then. It was just the president's mansion. By the way, that's where the Star-Spangled Banner comes from. Francis Scott Key was locked up in a prison across the harbor, and he was watching the battle in I think it was Chesapeake Bay, and saw the rockets' red glare and all that. But they failed to retake their breakaway colony, and America began developing. And the empire tried again during the Civil War. Divide and conquer. That's the empire's age-old scheme. And the City of London, they were already benefiting from the cotton slave trade, the cotton from the South. Well, the slaves were taken to the South by British boats up until they banned it in, I think it was 1830. But they just outsourced it to the Spanish and whoever else. But then the cotton was taken to the mills in Birmingham, Manchester, wherever, where the 10-year-olds were working the spinners 12 hours a day. Then the cloth was taken to India and spun, and the British had planted their poppies there. They'd harvest the opium and take it to China, and then that's where they got the gold. And they went on a circuit like that. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. So the British sponsored the South, the Confederacy, during the Civil War, and they threatened to blockade the ports of the North. And Russia intervened, and the Tsar said that if Britain blockaded the North, the Russian Navy would get involved. And so that didn't happen, and we know how history turned out. Lincoln won the war, and the British were foiled again. But the empire doesn't give up. Well, after Lincoln was assassinated, it's interesting, Lyndon LaRouche wrote an article about 20 years ago. I think it's still in print. Why the British kill American presidents. And there have been 4 American presidents who have been assassinated, and all 4 of them had a particular outlook to advance what is called the American system of economy. And it looks like Donald Trump is going that way as well, so look out. But after the war, Lincoln put into motion this massive nation-building project that the world had never seen. It started off with the Transcontinental Railroad, and then all the inventions that were coming into existence from Edison and many other inventors. Other nations started aspiring to that American model, particularly Japan, Germany, and Russia. That was before the USSR, of course. There was a World's Fair in the United States in Philadelphia in the latter part of the 1870s, showcasing, what was going on in the United States. It was sort of like what China's doing now with their new Silk Road and high-speed rails everywhere. So a lot of world leaders went to Philadelphia, and they were inspired. So the empire could see that where this was going, and King George did his best to put in place the machinations that would trigger a war in Europe. And he didn't live to see it, but his successor did. And, of course, it's originally called the Great War, and now we call it the First World War, World War I, whatever. Well, anyway, the empire didn't get its desired results. And they knew they could never take down the United States in a direct military confrontation. They tried to destroy the nations that were aspiring to that model, and we have to say they were somewhat successful at that time. But they put in place organizations and a scheme, a very brilliant scheme, that if we cannot take them head on, let's use subversion. Let's infiltrate the United States, their political systems, their education system. Let's bring them around to our way of thinking. Let's subjugate them through their own stupidity and use them. There's a saying that London is the brains and America will be the brawn. Well, some of the institutions they put in place are the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. It's functional now. Its sister organization in London was the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And the reason they were set up is because after the war, Woodrow Wilson was somewhat of an Anglophile. He was committed to setting up this League of Nations, which was a scheme of the empire to get the nations under control of a central government, world government. That's always been the goal of this empire. Well, guess what? These rebel Americans, isolationists, America firsters and all that, the Congress voted it down. It was a treaty. It had to be adopted as a treaty. See, the United States wasn't even part of the League of Nations. And, of course, it failed in due time. Well, because of that defeat, as I say, they already had their central bank in place. But that wasn't enough. They put in place this organization, the CFR and Royal Institute of International Affairs, to exchange ideas, to inject this imperial thinking into this rebel America. And the reason they did that was because of the failure of the United States to join the League. Well, the next time around, after the Second World War, came the United Nations, and America was indeed part of that. But gradually, now we see that the empire has been successful in taking the military apparatus of the United States and using it as if it were the British Empire. And we see that, for example, any nation that opposes this globalism, that's the word instead of British Empire, I couldn't think of it a minute ago, globalism. Any nation that doesn't get on board with that, they are punished in various ways, financially, sometimes militarily. And all we have to do is look at the case of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He nationalized his oil. It was talking about dropping the petrodollar. What happened? He's got weapons of mass destruction. Lie. Boom. They hung him. And now Iraq is totally destroyed and in chaos. And the Anglo-American oil companies moved in. And remember Muammar Gaddafi? He was one of the most progressive leaders in northern Africa. People in Libya had it made. No taxes, free everything, free education, free health care. He was giving money to a lot of the undeveloped nations in Africa, and he was talking about breaking with the petrodollar, setting up a gold exchange. Before you knew it, Muammar was met the same fate. So you see a pattern here. Well, the empire is really come up against it because there's only so long that you can advance, this fictitious money and expect people to. Their financial empire is going to come unglued. It almost did, 10 years ago. They cobbled it together with trillions and trillions of dollars, which the debt of which they imposed on taxpayers for the most part. And anyway, we're coming to this point where the time of the end describes this pushing between the king of the north and the king of the south. I want to go back, though, to a comment I made that the Watchtower has advanced some erroneous ideas that we can verify are erroneous. If my iPad's still on, I'd like to share a scripture with you. This is down in verse 36. The king of the north, will do as he pleases, and he will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god and against the God of gods. That's Jehovah, isn't it? He will speak astonishing things, and he will prove successful until the denunciation comes to a finish. Because what is determined must take place. So this king of the north will succeed all the way to the end. How about the king of the south? No mention of it beyond the time where Egypt is subjugated, does not escape from the king of the north, and he rules over their hidden treasures, gold and silver. Think about it. The United States has $20 trillion in debt. To who? Well, when that debt comes due and the dollar is worthless, the creditors can demand whatever. See, we see how this empire operates. You can take a look at it from the European Union. That is a mini empire over all of these nations because it circumvents their national sovereignty. Remember, that's the conflict between empire and the nation states that developed after the Treaty of Westphalia. So by disinvesting themselves from their own national currencies, the nations of Europe are no longer sovereign. They may think they are until they try to go against Brussels, and then the guns come out. We saw it in Greece a few years ago, and we're seeing it in Italy now. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, Parliament was about to put into office a fellow who was somewhat of a nationalist and opposed to the euro. Brussels just completely nullified it. And the finance minister of the euro said, next time Italians want to think about electing a populist, putting a populist into office, they'll know that the markets will punish them. The markets. Who controls the markets? It's not the day trader. It's the empire. Anyway, so the scripture tells us that this king of the north will succeed all the way to the end. The Watchtower has assumed. They assume, well, Michael stands up and he destroys the king of the north and the king of the south. But there's no mention of the king of the south. What's it say? And he will come all the way to his end, and there'll be no helper for him. Who is he? The king of the north. The king of the south has already been subjugated. So this situation here, where the king will exalt himself and raise himself above every god, that would include the gods over which Christendom represents, right? We won't call him Jehovah God, but like the British Crown is actually the head of the Church of England, just like the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. So this empire will show no regard for that God, and it will do as it pleases. Well, we've established the fact that the King of the North is not on hand at the end. But how will this King of the North speak astonishing things against the God of gods? We have to appreciate that this prophecy is not necessarily written in chronological order, verse by verse. This happens, and this happens, and this happens. I think it gives us previews of what will happen and then takes us back to a timeline. I won't go into that now, except to make the point that in the 13th chapter of Revelation, there's a wild beast whose head receives a mortal wound and comes back to life and is given authority over God's people for 42 months, and it opens its mouth and speaks great blasphemies against the God of heaven and against the angels in heaven, and it conquers the holy ones. Well, the Watchtower claims that this beast received the death stroke back in World War II, which I won't debunk that again. It just cannot possibly be, because that is when the beast revives from its fatal wound, that is when people began receiving the mark of the beast. And once you receive the mark, that's it. You can't erase it. You are doomed. You're not in the book of life. So it's simply ridiculous to assume that this marking began in 1922, as the Watchtower teaches. So what we're looking at is a future cataclysm where the political system is virtually taken down, blown up, and a new order ascends. And that is when this King of the North will speak these astonishing blasphemies and persecute God's people. Will that be the British Empire? It will have another name. It's not called the British Empire now. But we see now that the United States is asserting itself. It's trying to break free from this globalism and the shackles imposed upon it. And the empire is most concerned that Donald Trump is going to ally himself with Russia, China, and India and form this new bloc of nations and join the new Silk Road, which would totally put an end to the British financial system. This new Silk Road, it's much more than Silk Road. The Chinese have their own bank to rival the Bank of Settlements and, the World Bank and the IMF and all of that. It's the emergence of a new system. And if the United States signs on to that, bye-bye City of London. So they're desperate right now, and they're intent on igniting a war. They have the power to just pull the plug on the whole financial shebang, and I'm certain that that's what they'll do at some point. And that will be the end of the nation state. That's been the goal all along, to destroy sovereign nation states that protect its people from the ravages of this beast. That's not to say that the nation state system is any less beastly, but it is. That's the clay aspect of America. People have, godliness in them. If you go back, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. If you go back to the 10th chapter, closing of the 10th chapter, where the angel prepares Daniel to receive this, to receive this prophecy. He says that he had stood up as a strengthener to the king of Persia. Well, we know that Persia is part of this seven-headed wild beast, right? It is one of the empires that control God's people. And yet this angel of Jehovah says that he stood up as a strengthener to this king who's part of this satanic political system. Well, that was for the benefit of God's people, so that they could be released from Persia at that time, because Persia conquered Babylon, and then they were supported on their way back to rebuild Jerusalem. Well, who's to say that the angel of Jehovah has not stood up as a strengthener to America, the clay, to oppose this empire and its totalitarian rule in order for Jehovah's purpose to be accomplished? And what would that be? The preaching of the good news. So once that is accomplished, time of the end. We do away with the nation-state system. The United States and all of its guarantees of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, that'll all be gone. When this new beast ascends, this new empire, it will be a world government and a tyrannical beast. The 13th chapter of Revelation says it will begin speaking as a dragon. In other words, the mask comes off and you can see that this system is controlled by Satan, the devil. So that's where we stand. I hope I made sense in this primer, and we'll be talking about this some more as things develop. But it is getting interesting, and well, that's about it. Thanks.